He's the first non-white prime minister, first prime minister from an Indian background, which I think, from that perspective, will actually, be so significant to so many people around the country who come from not just Indian backgrounds
Right.
themselves, but from other ethnic minorities. I mean, I think his story, actually resonates with a lot of people. His parents came from East Africa, I believe, immigrated to the UK in the 1960s. So I think, the fact that we now have a non-white prime minister is very significant in terms of the kind of social dimension of the country, and it's something
Right.
that should be lauded for anyone that really values, diversity and multiculturalism within the UK. But you're absolutely right in what you say that he has many different sort of sides to him. And I think one aspect that is quite difficult for many people in the public to deal with is the fact that he is, of course, astonishingly wealthy. He was in Goldman Sachs before he was in politics, made a very large amount of money. And at a time when he will have to sort of balance the fiscal books, and he'll have to find at least £38 billion worth of cuts if he's not going to borrow, resulting from the U-turns that happened over the last week with the mini budget. He's going to likely have to cut some kind of public spending. So I think the optics of that are very, very difficult for him when you have a very wealthy individual who is cutting public spending for people. The people who really feel those kind of cuts are actually the poorest in society. So I think that's going to be a really difficult challenge for him. I think there's a kind of third aspect to it, which is the fact that he's quite fortunate in that he kind of comes after Truss and Johnson in the sense that actually people appreciate him as someone who brings a sense of professionalism and integrity to the job, because of course those were sort of major issues, particularly under Boris Johnson, where he simply just didn't present himself as a sort of typical professional politician. He was very difficult. Of course, for some people, that was Boris Johnson's appeal, but ultimately that caused Boris Johnson a lot of problems. So I think there's to some extent a sigh of relief that even if they don't agree with his policies, you're still going to see a sort of better, run Downing Street with hopefully more competence than Johnson and Truss.
But how would you express this to the world in terms of how the UK sees itself now? And maybe it's surprising as well that it's a member of the Conservative Party that is in this position. Conservatives normally seen as to the right of politics. Some people think of that as sort of anti-immigration politics and so on and so forth. So how does this all fit together?
Yes, I think you're absolutely correct to draw attention to the fact that, Britain does have a political class that has existed, not only for decades, but for hundreds of years. And just simply due to the fact that Rishi Sunak is not white, comes from a sort of ethnic minority background, does, show that, Britain to some extent is in a new era, from the sense that British prime ministers are no longer sort of exclusively selected from an all-white background. And as I say, that's something that, regardless of whether you agree with his policies or disagree with him, I think is, really a tremendous thing. And it does show
Absolutely.
a degree of progress in terms of ensuring that actually people from different ethnic backgrounds do have opportunities. But of course, it doesn't necessarily mean that issues that face minorities in the UK, are simply disappeared, because of course, the Asian community for such a long time, certainly since there's been, immigration in large numbers from the sort of 1960s, has faced a huge amount of, social sort of, to some extent, segregation, but also just prejudice. And that's something that, even though we've made huge progress on over the last decade, there's still something that's felt, on the streets by so many people. But I think what this does is show, young Asian people in the UK that, in fact, just because they are from a non-white background doesn't mean there is necessarily a reason why they shouldn't make it to the very top. I mean, I think, there is one other side to it, the fact that, Sunak does come from quite a well-off background. I mean, he, wasn't born into enormous wealth. I believe his parents had worked in the NHS and as a chemist.
Yes.
But there is the fact that, he is a very wealthy individual, and so to some extent he may not necessarily resonate with everyone, just due to the fact that, class is not just split over ethnic lines, but actually on economic lines and sort of financial lines as well. So I think there's also that degree. But certainly, no one can deny that this is a huge moment in terms of sort of racial progress in the UK.